Hello. Is it working? There's like a spinning wheel and I'm not entirely certain. Okay, now I am live. Okay. It's changing. Facebook is changing all the things on me right now. So I've been going live just from my page and now there's like this professional recording studio thing that they're doing and I haven't used it before, but I figured that since they told me today that I may not be allowed to use the one I've been using much longer, I figured it's probably time to get to figure out the new version. And so here I am. And I hope that this works. So today is day 7 of my read aloud. It's getting a little confusing because sometimes I am doing more than one chapter depending on the chapter length, and so trying to remember which day we're on related to which chapter I'm reading is a little bit tricky. I probably shouldn't have done that to myself, but some of the chapters are only like a page or two long, and I feel like that would be a pretty short story time. So, like for example, today we're going to read chapters 7 and 8 because chapter 7 is a little short, and then chapter 8 is really short. So we'll be reading chapters 7 and 8, and then we will be about halfway through the book. To be perfectly honest, we're gonna get to about there. So it will be good. And I don't know if anybody is actually watching because I don't know if it tells me that anymore. So that's kind of sad. So if you're there, say hi. And I will try not to get too distracted by it. And I hope you all are doing well and that you are enjoying the last day of March and getting ready for tomorrow being April 1st. And it being April 1st could be interesting. If any of you have pranksters living in your house, hopefully we'll be calm and they'll all yell rabbit rabbit at me when they realize it's the first day of the month, but we don't do a whole lot of April Fool's stuff here. So oh, hi Uncle Noel and Aunt Jan. Happy you're here. So anyway, there was something I was going to say and then the whole like new video thingy threw me. Oh, if you're enjoying this book and you really want a copy of your own, they are available on Amazon. And if you have a Kindle and that's how you read, they are always free. Always. If you have, and you can actually find them free on Smashwords if you have something other than a Kindle, like a Nook Reader or something like that. It's free in all the different platforms as an ebook. This paperback is $4.62 on Amazon. I make no money on it. It is my grandma's book, and I didn't feel right making money on it. So I've set the price as low as I can possibly go without actually having to owe Amazon every time someone buys it, because I can't afford that either. So yeah, you can buy the paperback for less than $5, or you can get the ebook for free always, anytime you like. And now that we're a couple minutes in, I am going to get started. So today we are reading chapter 7, which is called Sarah. Miriam poured linseed oil into Mr. Cheney's old t-shirt and rubbed it into the parched bamboo chair on the Cheneys' sun porch. She polished industriously and was pleased with the shiny new look the oil gave to the old furniture. Mrs. Cheney looked up from her tub of string beans she was snapping into a pail of cold water. "Sure brings 'em to life, Miriam," she encouraged. "I've had that table and chair since the first year we were married." "How long is that, Mrs. Cheney?" Miriam asked. She liked the company and the approval. The bamboo reeds of the chairs, which had baked in many afternoon suns, now inhaled the oil, and the room had a pleasant, lemony odor. Miriam's hands, too, began to be oiled, and she tried snapping her fingers. They slipped against one another, and she was amused by her ineffectual attempts. "Why, almost 30 years now," Mrs. Cheney answered her question thoughtfully. "Hard for me to think Sarah'd be almost that old by now." Miriam looked up, surprised. She had never heard Mrs. Cheney mention Sarah before, but she herself knew there had been a Sarah. Mrs. Cheney caught her look and offered a little more. "Why, she'd be 23 now." She paused, and Miriam felt almost as though she were stepping out onto holy ground when she asked, "What happened, Mrs. Cheney?" She felt somehow it was all right now to ask, though there were many things you just left alone. Mr. Green had told the family that the Cheneys had had a daughter named Sarah, who had died. This was the most she had ever heard about it, now in the naturalness of the bean snapping and linseed oil. "Sarah got sick real sudden," Mrs. Cheney said. "She'd just had 1 year of high school, and there was always something going around. It was late in the summer, like now." Her voice slowed, but she went on. "We weren't even frightened. It all happened so fast. It just seemed like a fever, normal as any summer cold. But by evening she was so hot we got real scared. Mr. Cheney and I drove her into Redney to the hospital, and Dr. Williams met us there." The recollection was a vivid memory for Mrs. Cheney, but a new picture for Miriam. She could sense a vulnerability in this kindly couple who seemed so confident of all things in life. It was like the distant watercolor of a fisherman her mother had on the living room wall. He always looked, to Miriam, like a person that nothing could ruffle or upset. Someone who would never raise his voice if his house burned down, or if a war started, or if he hurt himself like people always did when they worked hard. Miriam assimilated all this in a growing awareness that Mrs. Cheney's gentle authority was not a gift, but a result. She remembered a poem they'd read in literature class about a primrose path, and another one with thorns and thistles, and this reminded her of that, though she wasn't just certain why. Having a little girl die was something Miriam could only imagine. Maybe the man who drew the fisherman had had things like that happen in his life, too. "It was polio, Miriam, and summer's the worst time. Now they've learned so much about how to cure it. The Lord is good to have shown a way." "Did you think he was good when she died?" The calm in Mrs. Cheney's voice invited Miriam's boldness. "Why, yes, child, I did. Oh, we hurt, but we had one to go to who knows what it is to hurt, and he just wrapped us up and comforted us all the while." Miriam was amazed at the calm, at the assurance, even way back then, when the hurt must have been terrible. People were always so quiet at death, or the thought of it. It was something hard to be talked about, and here was Mrs. Cheney telling her right out about the death of her little daughter. Plain and simple, telling her about the Lord comforting, not years after it was over, but right then, at the time. And then Mrs. Cheney even laughed. "You know," she said, "the Lord has some ways to lighten our hearts when they are most likely to bog us down into despair. Our Sarah wasn't afraid to die, and though we didn't know she would, it helped us to know she wasn't afraid. I think the Lord speaks to children's hearts about things like that." Mrs. Cheney said, snapping the beans. She got up and left the room for a moment and came back with a small, framed photograph. "This is Sarah, Miriam," she said, offering the photo. Miriam felt honored. She held the small frame and examined it thoughtfully. "She's pretty," she said. "How old was she?" 14 when she died. That was taken a year before, at her 8th grade graduation," Mrs. Cheney went on, invited by Miriam's interest. She seemed glad for the opportunity of recalling. "One night, when Sarah lay so sick, we'd been with her for 72 hours, and things looked some better. The fever had come down. Doctor told us to go home and get a shower and freshen up and get some rest and then come back. And so we did. But on the way out, there was this young man on a bed in the hall. Hospital seemed to be full those hot summer days. Well, he was cussing at the nurses, and I never heard such misery and pain coming out of one person in all my days. Pain kind of brings out the worst in you sometimes. It can make a person strong, or it can make him bitter." Miriam says, "Mom says so too. Makes me cantankerous," she says. Mrs. Cheney smiled. "Well, you might have called him cantankerous then. I couldn't just leave him like that, without some way to bring a little comfort. It's hurt or anger makes a person tear out like that, you know." Miriam had put down her oiled cloth to listen. She thought she did know, especially when she thought of Mr. Johnson and how he used to be to Greg. Mrs. Cheney went on. "I went over to him. Turns out he was blind. He'd lost a kidney, had a wife and 2 youngsters, and the kidney disease hit him sudden. Poor soul. He'd had his world turned upside down in just a short time. So had the Cheneys, Miriam thought. I went over and took his hand when I knew he couldn't see me. He was sort of shocked, but he got real quiet after all the thrashing around. I asked him, "Son, wouldn't you like to give your life to the Lord?" What did he say? Miriam was not surprised at her boldness. She wouldn't put anything past Mrs. Cheney. He surprised me, Miriam. Doesn't matter how much you learn, you'll never be ready for every situation the Lord allows to come your way. He said to me, "Give my life to him? He can have it. It never did me any good." Oh, he was spiteful. But I just felt that the Lord understood all that inside raging. I didn't have any more questions for him, so I just stood there holding his hand. He never pulled his away, in spite of all that anger, and I didn't let go. Well, it was so pitiful. I wasn't able to do a thing for him, but I kept calling out to the Lord inside, and I found something out later on. What did you find out? Miriam's question was natural, but eager. I found out he went home about 3 weeks later. I don't know what happened to him, but a woman in town told me he'd said to his wife he'd never have made it through the night if some lady hadn't come by and held his hand and reminded him there was a God out there after all. When he realized how mad he was, he didn't think it was possible to be so mad at nothing, and so, mad or not, realizing there was a God helped. Did you ever feel he wasn't there? Miriam asked, especially when Sarah died. She felt that Sarah was her friend now, as well as Mrs. Cheney's daughter. No, I can't say as I did, Miriam. I sure do understand folks who do feel that way at times, though. She looked for words to help explain. There was a man I met once, she went on. Didn't believe there was a God. Miriam looked startled. Matter of fact, Miriam, it was your neighbor, Ted Johnson. Mrs. Cheney offered this information after careful thought, and then she went on. His father had been a drunkard, and the family didn't have a good name for all the bills that man had run up. Ted couldn't seem to get out from under the shame of it, though we'd hoped so once he married Martha. She had a way of settling him. Seemed real content for a little while, but time went on, and he seemed to start taking it out by being hard and sullen to his own sons. He scoffed at the idea of a God, let alone a personal God who died for him and cared about his life. Did he ever find out different? Miriam asked, with the persistence of a child who will have a happy ending to the story. I don't know. Our Sarah used to care for his boys before she died. He liked her real well. She was special to him, and he had a soft spot in his heart for her through all that toughness. Did Sarah know he didn't believe there was a God? I believe she did, Miriam. You don't want to go making someone something they weren't. But I believe the Lord gives wisdom to young folks we sometimes lose when we get older. Maybe when we're less complicated, we have a clearer vision of things. Anyhow, when our Sarah died, he came to the cemetery. Didn't come to the funeral, but he was there at the grave. He looked so helpless. I found my heart going out to him. I told him Sarah was safe at home with Jesus, but he just stared at me. Then he said something real hurtful. What was that? Miriam asked in a small voice. He said, "Can't make me believe there's a God, let that happen." Maybe he was mad at God? Miriam remembered Buffy and her mom and Mrs. Jordan. Mrs. Cheney smiled. Why, I suspect that's right, Miriam. If you didn't know the suffering Savior, you wouldn't understand such a thing without being mad. I was going to wait till later on, but it seemed then was the time. So I told him Sarah had wanted his boys to have Missy. She was just a pup then, born to our Pearl. She was Sarah's special pup, and she'd play with the boys where Sarah would babysit them. Miriam knew the Johnsons didn't have Missy, so she waited. Mrs. Cheney's eyes had filled with tears. Guess the tears are never gone, Miriam, but I'm glad to share them a bit. It'd be so easy never to talk about our loved ones gone on ahead, but you know, it leaves such an awful hole down here. Helps fill it up to talk Miriam wanted so badly to help fill up that empty hole, and all the while her listening heart was doing that admirably. She told me that if she ever died, I believe she knew she would soon, but didn't want to frighten me. She thought Mr. Johnson would help the boys raise Missy. She sure loved those little scamps, Greg and Tom. Did she frighten you when she talked that way? Well, you'd think so. But the Lord has a special way of bearing you up times like that. I'd read Little Women to Sarah when she was younger, and we'd cried together over Beth's dying. But she thought it was too bad she and Joe hadn't talked more about it. I always remembered that. Miriam remembered Little Women too, but she'd never talked about it with anyone. Did you talk about heaven, Mrs. Cheney? She asked. Yes, we did, Miriam. And you know, sorry. Heaven becomes dearer. Heaven becomes dearer when a loved one goes on ahead. My daddy always told me he didn't want to live a long life. People who live long, he said, live to see their children die. He lived to see his granddaughter die. Miriam. There's just no place to put pain like that, except in Jesus. She had picked up the beans again and busied herself. It was some moments later when Miriam asked, "What about Missy?" He never answered me, just turned and walked away. I think my timing was poor. It just seemed to come out then about Sarah wanting his boys to have Missy. He hadn't settled with himself yet. There's a lot of anger in that man, but there's a lot of tenderness, down deep. He used to bring eggs to pay for the babysitting, and Thanksgiving time he'd bring over 2 of his best chickens. Mrs. Johnson would have 'em plucked clean as a whistle. And one Easter, he came over with Greg and Tom. They were about 3 and 4, I believe. They had a Sears Roebuck shoebox, and it was for Sarah. Well, inside were 2 fluffy little newborn chicks, peeping for all they were worth. The boys had seen them hatch, and bringing them to Sarah was Easter for them. She raised them and knew that they were a very special gift. That's why she wanted them to have Missy. There just never was a good time to offer again. A person has to sort things out. You have to be careful of trotting on their feelings. Miriam couldn't imagine Mrs. Cheney trotting on anything. Missy became Josh's dog. Miriam knew Joshua was the Cheney's son, away at college for another year. He was 12 then, time when you're starting to ignore a sister a little. Miriam could remember when Jeff was 12 and she was 6. That was before the teasing had become sort of warm and friendly. He hadn't paid much attention to her at all, as she remembered back. She felt she understood what Mrs. Cheney was describing. Missy became sort of a gap filler for Josh. He began taking her with him everywhere, and now when he comes home from school, she just about goes crazy. Came time we couldn't have given her away even if they'd come for her. How did they get Queenie? Do you know? Miriam asked. Would you believe Josh brought her home? Mrs. Cheney smiled, remembering with Miriam the arrival of Kitty. He and Sarah loved all the animals. Miriam smiled, assimilating all this. Why, then, Sarah sort of did have her way, didn't she? The whole idea was thrilling Miriam. One of your dogs went to Tom and Greg. I put Queenie in that same shoebox they'd brought the chicks in. She didn't fit well, but it seemed a good way to give, without having to explain. We brought her over and asked Mrs. Johnson if we could give her to the boys. We told her Sarah would like that. Besides, a good dog's a help on a farm, and we knew the Johnsons would be good to her. She was touched, I know, but there never was a comment from Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson's not angry inside anymore, Mrs. Cheney. Miriam told her then about offering Moses and what Mr. Johnson had said to her, and how he and Greg were talking and friendly now. She told her, too, about how they had all helped when Moses had been bitten. Mrs. Cheney thought, what a heart softener a little girl could be. Miriam asked, Mrs. Cheney, why is it some people get strong and some people get sort of mean when sad things happen? Like Mr. Johnson's father being a drunkard. I think, Miriam, it has a lot to do with receiving comfort. There's usually always lots of comfort all about. Some people know just what to say, and some know just what not to say, but there's something in being able to hear beyond the words or the quiet, and to know that other heart is just caring and caring. And if you can lean into that sort of, and receive the comfort they're just nearly groaning to give, why then it can make you strong. But if you somehow can't receive it, or don't recognize it, or even try to lean into it, then I suppose you can get hardened up some. Miriam was making Mrs. Cheney thoughtful, and she wasn't sure if she really had helped Miriam understand better. But Miriam looked thoughtful too, and satisfied. She really does remind me of Sarah, Mrs. Cheney told Mr. Cheney that night. They sat together on the linseed-oiled chairs, and he squeezed her hand. Glad that she would not allow the memory of Sarah in their lives to become distant and barren. He suspected that, left to himself, he might do that for his own equilibrium. Maybe equilibrium wasn't always so important. He realized again how much he loved this woman with a sprawling white cat in her lap and a feisty dog at her feet, and her returned squeeze assured him that it was mutual. Sorry, the chapter's a little hard on me. I'm going to read chapter 8 as well, which is called Moses. Moses sat near the back door with his leather purse. He often dragged it about by the one strap, which had long since detached at one end. He would carry it with him to the creek, and it sometimes smelled of dead fish. It wasn't allowed in the house anymore, because it had been under the tree swing in the last heavy rain, and it smelled of mildew. Ants crawled in and out, and field mice had once made a nest inside. It was rotted and stiff and despised of men. To Moses, it was most beloved. Moses picked it up by its bedraggled strap and dragged it to the creek. Early mornings, Miriam would let Moses out, and he would run to the creek and follow his well-traveled itinerary. If he were king of this, his own small corner of the world, then he surveyed his domain in excited inquiry without a hint of proprietorship, for he was challenged daily by a woodchuck who would rise up on his hind legs in a face-off with Moses awaiting a challenge. Moses's few barks were kept for the woodchuck. He would prance forward and brace his front paws on a 45-degree angle with the ground so that his head and shoulders were lower than his hindquarters. Then he would bark ferociously until the woodchuck would tire of his harangue and walk off in disdain. At these times, Moses considered himself the absolute victor. Sometimes, Moses' adversary would turn and almost meander into a burrow as if bored with the frivolity of the foolish youngster. This retreat would inspire Moses to a wonderful chase, directly into the burrow after the woodchuck, as fast and as far as he could go. But he always seemed to hit a dead-end tunnel. He did not know that a woodchuck is able to seal off his burrow from outside intrusion with heavy digging claws whose excavation skills far exceed the digging skills of any dog. These were perplexing dilemmas for Moses, but when the woodchuck would exhibit bad temper and his chirping and whistling would become a low, ominous growl, Queenie's nature would rise up in her pup and have dominion. Moses would retreat and find other interests. Occasionally, it would be Nero. Nero was owned by Hank and Abe Zender, the boys who lived about half a mile east of the Greens, with the open field between their properties. Hank was Jeff's age, and Abe was 2 years younger. They both had bellicose natures, well touted by the principals in their small town, especially those connected with the high school. When their pranks were confined to egg-throwing and hurled epithets on the last day of school, the officials tended not to see these things, and to breathe a second sigh of relief for summer. But when bicycles went missing from the rack outside the main office entrance, and students were urged to padlock their lockers, the obvious suspects were Hank and Abe, with ample history to substantiate the suspicions. Nero seemed to reflect his owner's temperaments, as is often the case. The boys were much more formidable when paired. Singly, they were at least civil, and at times near teachable. When together, as they usually were, their company was unsolicited and unsavory. Nero, however, needed no partner, only a victim. He found Moses right handy. When Moses would trot along his self-appointed rounds, it was Nero's sadistic nature to pace him. Moses was irrepressibly friendly on their first encounter, slavish in his young welcome. He pranced up to Nero in exuberant naivete. Nero's slash, cutting Moses' ear until it drew blood, came without even a warning snarl. Moses would have bowed quickly to the authority of the older dog had there been the least indication. Non-vicious dogs have a sort of civil code implicit in first encounters. But Nero was not amenable to civil codes, canine or otherwise. Moses had cried out and retreated, but in near pathetic yearning for friendliness, he left the door ever open for Nero to change his mind. And so, whenever he and Nero would cross paths, he had the good sense not to initiate an exchange, but he did not run or retreat. He would sit and wait and hope. Nero sensed this and capitalized on it. In a daily drama which seemed to gratify his power lust temporarily, he would look at Moses and then turn and trot off as though inviting Moses to follow, and Moses would. As soon as this walk was established, Nero would stop, and Moses would have to freeze where he was. In an almost hypnotic fashion, Nero would choreograph the daily walk, enticing Moses, then freezing him, until he would tire of the whole thing and dismiss his subject by a sudden slash of his teeth at the pup, then by stalking off alone. Moses was free to return home when Nero was out of sight. Moses had left his purse on the bank of the creek. Though the straps had been chewed thin and soft, the main body of the purse stood gaping like an open mouth, sun-parched and cracked, one strap lying stretched out on the slope of the bank. This is how the second morning visitor of the cool creek waters found it. The skunk had made Moses' acquaintance once before, and they had had a cordial relationship since. The first time Moses had come upon the small, white-striped animal ambling toward the waters in a bear-like roll, he had barked an initiative greeting. The skunk looked at Moses, unperturbed, and then continued toward the creek. Moses was not platonic. He would have an exchange with this calm, furry stranger. In fact, he insisted upon it with a series of staccato barks, and they were fruitful. The animal, so wont to ignore him, now seemed to turn amiably to face him. Moses was highly interested. If a clip of greeting barks brought this interest, then surely a volley of ferocious barks, such as were reserved for the woodchuck, were in order. He filled the morning mists with energetic challenge. The skunk responded, first by staring at Moses, then he slowly shook his head from side to side. When Moses continued barking, he arched his back and thumped the ground with flat-soled, paw-like tappings. This did nothing to reduce the volley, and so, reluctantly perhaps, the little skunk lifted his tail, turned away from Moses, and sprayed. A thin stream of acrid sulfide covered all the ground within a radius of 10 feet, including wild phlox, marsh grasses, a tumbled-down river oak, and the terrified Moses. He was momentarily blinded and near asphyxiated. He finished the day rinsing in the creek waters, and when he had returned to the house, he had the grace to look sheepish and to approach cautiously. And even after Miriam had washed him in 3 quarts of her mother's homemade tomato juice to neutralize the skunk odor, and had lathered him unmercifully with Lifebuoy bar soap, he was not allowed back into the house for a full 3 days. Moses remembered all this now, as he withdrew a respectful and healthy distance. The little black and white skunk took leisurely dominion of the territory, beloved purse and all. The skunk found it interesting, and he rooted about the purse, investigating for bees, wasps, or ants. Any one of these would make an acceptable breakfast. Moses watched, and the skunk, finding a collection of ants in the purse, waddled in after them, content in his investigations. It was at this time that Nero raced down to the creek and saw Moses several yards from his purse. This, perhaps, offered a new avenue of entertainment. Nero knew that the purse belonged to Moses, and so now, without even a greeting snarl, he took over. Head down, with the hair on his scruff raised, he lifted the purse by the bottom with the clear intention of claiming it for his own. Being Moses' exclusive property made this a better treasure than even a succulent bone for the new distress it would afford his victim. And Moses looked as though the whole scene pained him, though eyeing his beloved purse he didn't advance an inch. He simply crouched in the grasses about 20 feet off, watching. Nero did not have long to savor his advantage and his thievery. The purse, lying so passively one moment, now seemed to attack him. More quickly than Nero could follow with his eyes, which had been directed toward Moses in his discomfiture, the furry, white-plumed visitor left the bag, lifted his tail, and baptized Nero in near total immersion. eyes, throat, lungs, head, body, all. Nero, after that, disdained the company of Moses entirely. Moses took on a new dignity by putting away childish things and laying aside his purse once for all. I think we will probably be hearing more from Nero and his owners. It sounds like they've been introduced now, so we will see what happens with them. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed these chapters, and I will be here for you tomorrow.